Welcome to another edition. This is our 8th session of Old Testament survey. We got as far as the biblical flood, Noah's flood last time. So we've gone rather quickly through the text, but last time we looked at some of the geological evidence for a universal flood. Most people would agree that there is an awful lot of sediment, an awful lot of fossils, an awful lot of evidence that at one time there was a huge catastrophic event on the Earth. When we look at the sequence of things that are going on, there's relatively little geologically that has happened since the time of the flood. There's a few other things, like here in our neighborhood, there's a 3 or 4 state area that was once covered by a flood that was not Noah's flood. We call that the Great Missoula Flood. And it happened probably about 100 years after Noah's flood. But other events, volcanoes and mountain building and all kinds of stuff like that has happened since the flood. But it can be related to the geographic strata that's been laid down by that gigantic event. Now, Noah's involvement in the flood lasted for 1 full year. We're told near the end of chapter 8 that it was the 601st year, the first month of the first day of the month. The waters were dried. Noah removed the covering, looked around, the face of the ground was dry. And in the second month, on the 27th day, which is just a little bit later, a couple of months later, he was quarantined for a long time. He decided that it's time to go out from the ark. The raven had gone and didn't come back. The dove had gone and finally came back and then went away and stayed away. And now it's time for Noah to lead everyone out. So all the birds and the animals and the rest of them came out of the ark and dispersed. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and every beast, and they all went out of the ark. So there we have it. That's a year-long process. The catastrophe itself began with the falling of rain, just torrential rain for 40 days, so that the water came up to an altitude above the highest mountains. I suspect some thousands of feet deep. There was a lot of water. It prevailed and sloshed back and forth with gravity and the movement of the earth for 150 days, and then it receded as the earth came up. The water ran off, mountains were formed, tremendous amounts of erosion took place, river valleys were formed, the ocean basins were formed. This is a tremendous worldwide catastrophic event. It is the premier object lesson of judgment in the whole Bible. If you want to know what the wrath of God looks like, look at the flood. That's an excellent example of that. And we saw at the introduction to the flood, I gave you a Venn diagram. It looked like this. Let's see if I can make this happen. Okay, presenter view, bingo. I showed you this one. The wrath of God is universal, and grace is the exception to the wrath of God. If wrath affects the whole earth, then even Noah was under the effects, the edict of the wrath of God. And it required an act of God's grace to forgive Noah for his sin and to make him right with God. That always everywhere, under every circumstance, throughout all of history, has been the method. Noah was not a righteous man because he chose to be good. Noah was a righteous man because of the grace of God. God reached down and did for Noah what he could not have done for himself. That is, to provide a way of escape from wrath. That's what that's the picture of Noah and his ark and the flood. And I believe that it's a very important picture. I believe that this is foundational to our understanding of how salvation works. Commentators on other sides of this issue have also understood the importance of this. And so either try to deny the historicity of the biblical flood, to deny the universality of the flood, or to deny that Noah's righteousness is the result of grace. There are those who argue that Noah was saved from the flood because he was a righteous man. The Bible tells us precisely the opposite. And all of that together is why the flood is such an important object lesson for understanding how salvation works. So this is going to go on, and Noah stayed in that ark all the way through chapter 7 and 8. And the end of chapter 8, out he comes. And when Noah came out in the end of chapter 8, we get on into chapter 9. And end of 8, verse 20, Noah built an altar. He took some of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Now, the burnt offering is an act of worship. When we get to Leviticus, I'll show you the 5 biblical, let me get my hand up so I've got 5, the 5 biblical offerings. And the first of these is the whole burnt offering. This is a pure act of worship. So very important. Noah apparently understood that because that's precisely the kind of sacrifice that he's making here. This is an act of personal submission to God. That's what worship is all about. And the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. The Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done, while the earth remains. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So the promise here is no additional catastrophes will come upon the earth until it's time for the earth to be gone entirely. So we've had a great catastrophe. That was the flood. What we're looking forward to is predicted in the New Testament. Actually, the Old Testament prophets predict this too. The time will come when the present heaven and earth will be done away. And Peter predicts that that will happen in a time of intense fire, a great heat, a flash of light, and the whole thing will just go. That comes at the very end of history. In the in-between times, summer and winter, seed time and harvest, heat and cold, the seasons will carry on in a very routine way. So we should not expect major geologic effects on a widespread scale as we saw with the flood. And that, of course, is exactly what we find. The modern secular idea of uniformitarianism, the idea that everything proceeds uniformly and summer and winter and seed time and harvest continue as they have forever and ever, is a reflection of the fact that ever since the flood, the earth has maintained an even keel. It has carried on normally and in a very predictable way. That's God's promise. That's God's promise. We see here verse 1 of chapter 9. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Now that's something that God had originally said to Adam and Eve. Now the command is repeated for Noah and his sons and their wives. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Now we've got some changes that take place in this, what we call Noahic covenant. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Oh, well, that's kind of scary. Noah and his sons had never deliberately killed an animal except for the sacrifice. And then it was a whole burnt offering. They didn't eat animals. Verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. So suddenly we have the third stage in the human diet. Adam and Eve were given fruit to eat. Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve after the time of the fall were given vegetables to eat, fruit and vegetables. It's not until we get to Noah that the diet is changed to what we would call the omnivorous human diet. From this time on, the human digestive system was changed. God did this as an act of creation. And from this time on, animal protein becomes a part of the diet. Now, it is possible to live a vegetarian life. It's just more difficult. Prior to the flood, Noah and his family were vegetarians. They ate fruits and vegetables. And their systems worked just fine with that. Now, God says you're going to normally need to eat animal protein. You're going to have meat, whether that's fish or birds or beef or lamb or whatever. You're going to have animal protein now, and that's too bad because it means that mankind and the animals could no longer be friends. Man is having a different relationship with the animals. I believe this is all a part of the curse. I don't think this is necessarily a good thing. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is the blood. So there's something special about blood. We'll see that more later on. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning from every beast. I'll require it from a man. From his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of a man. Okay, so there are actually two commands that are given there. One is that if an animal starts killing people, the community is responsible to deal with that animal. So if a bull gores people, you have to kill the bull. If a lion begins eating people in the village, you have to go out and kill the lion. And that's not only a right, but a responsibility. In very much the same way, God adds something here that has universal significance and ends up being fundamental to human life. It says, from his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of a man. Verse 6 lays it out quite clearly. Whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. Okay, that's the fundamental principle of what we call human government. God didn't tell Noah what kind of government to set up, but he did say that mankind has a responsibility to deal with the manslayer, the murderer. If someone commits murder by other men in that community, the murderer's life must be taken. Now, how do we do that? There are a variety of bad ways of doing that, and a relatively small number of good ways of taking care of that, but God doesn't tell us how to set up a system. He doesn't say elect a king, find a dictator. He doesn't tell us. He lets us figure that out on our own. He gives us the intelligence to decide how we want to govern ourselves. But whatever, at the core of government's authority is the responsibility to hold men accountable for human life. If I take human life, the government, not the mob, but the government must see to it that my life is taken. That's the rule. We call that capital punishment. When it happens, it's always a tragedy. When it has to happen, we all rightly feel badly about it. The executioner has a very difficult job. All of that is true. And sometimes we make a mistake and execute the wrong person. That's a terrible thing, and we all agree that that's wrong. But that doesn't change the fact that without the responsibility of capital punishment being taken, human government has no real authority. Human government cannot do what it must do unless it has the ability to take life. So policemen carry guns. And sadly, once in a while, they have to use them. So the justice system has the means of execution, whether that be a gas chamber or a hangman's noose or whatever. And that's a terrible thing. It's a terrible responsibility. On the national level, human governments have the responsibility of protecting the whole society against outside forces. This is the military. Military action is not always justified, but when it is justified, it's a terrible thing. A war is awful. No one who's ever been there thinks that a war is a good thing or would ever be in favor of going to war if it weren't the last choice. Nevertheless, there must be that option. And so we as Christians ought to support our local governments. We ought to be as submissive as we can be. This is why I haven't. I have disagreed with some of the decisions that our various governors have made about staying indoors and not going to church and wearing masks and all of the rest of it. But I don't go out in the streets and riot. I don't set fire to the local CNN station because I'm angry at my government. I can be irritated with my government and submissive at the same time. And that is what God normally requires of us. So something very big has happened right here at this moment that we call Noah's flood, and it has to do with the beginnings of human government. I'm going to give you a chart here, because what we've really got is a very big thing going on. Let's see if I can kill this. Stop that share. Let's see if I can start this one. Ooh, bingo. Okay. Let me show you a chart of what we typically call the dispensations. That's a great big word. The word dispensation is an English word that translates the Greek word oikonomia, or economy. And the principle is that throughout biblical history, God has dealt with man in different ways. The creation began things, and Adam and Eve were created. For the first little while, they lived in a condition of innocence. Oh, how do you spell innocence with it? There you go. That sounds right. So sometimes we call that the age of innocence, because they were innocent. They hadn't sinned yet. Then when the fall happens, we're going to have to call it something else. The flood happens about here. About this point, we're going to have Abraham. A little later, we've got Moses and the beginning of the law. About here, we're going to have Christ, and about here, we're going to have the second coming. Now that's followed by the end of things. Now, Paul uses the term dispensation. He speaks of the time from Moses to Christ as the dispensation of law. He speaks of the time from Christ to the second coming as the dispensation of grace. And he speaks of the time after the second coming as the fullness of time. I think that just barely got room there. So between the fall and Moses, there are some other little dispensations. This time between the fall and the flood seems to be different from the time between the flood and Abram. From the flood to Abram, we usually call the dispensation of human government, which, by the way, continues all the way through the rest of history. The time from Abraham to Moses, we usually call the dispensation of faith, because we have to call it something. And the characteristic of Abraham was his faith. The time between the fall and the flood is obviously different in a lot of ways from both what precedes and what follows. So we have given that the name conscience. Now, all of these dispensations to the left of Moses happen in the book of Genesis. And none of them have these names given to them in the Bible. These names were invented by theologians in the 18th and 19th centuries. Because as we were reading our Bibles, well, I wasn't among them, but as these old theologians were reading their Bibles, they realized that the dispensation of law and the dispensation of grace and the dispensation of the fullness of time are obviously different economies in the outworking of God's plan. And they could tell that the dispensation of law was changed radically by the coming of Christ, the death on the cross, his resurrection, and the planting of the church. It was just obvious that was the case. The dispensation of the fullness of time takes place after the second coming of Christ and as the eternal kingdom is being set up. It begins with the 1,000-year millennial kingdom and continues on into the eternal state. And that's obviously something different. Some things stayed the same, some things were added, and some things were taken away. In every case, when we look at the first four of these dispensations, we find the same characteristics. Some things stay the same, some things are eliminated, some things are added. in God's way of working with mankind. This chart of the dispensations is not intended to be doctrine. It's just a helpful outline of history. And it's what happens when we read the Bible. We'll use the word here, literally, literal interpretation. When used consistently, gets us here. Now, one of the things that happens when we look at the Bible from a dispensational viewpoint, we find that Israel, let me use a different color here, Israel and the church belong in different dispensations. Really, Israel fits in this time of the dispensation of law. Abraham is in some important ways the father of Israel, but the actual institutions of Israel wait for the coming of Moses. The church age happens after the cross. And the Old Testament people of God, Israel, are not the church. The church is not Israel. And the prophecies of the Old Testament for Israel are for Israel. Prophecies concerning the church are for the church. And we make that distinction not because that's the easiest way to do business, but because it appears to be correct. That's what the Bible actually teaches. So that's where dispensationalism comes from. That's some of the basic background of that. Let me see if I can find my screen, and we'll share this again. Okay, bingo. So the dispensation of human government gets started here at the time of Noah. And God said to Noah, "Behold, I'm going to establish my covenant with you." So there's several parts to the Noahic covenant, but the most important has to do with the promise of continuity and the responsibility of human government. And God said in verse 12, "This is a sign of the covenant that I make between you and every living creature that's with you for all future generations. I've set my bow in the cloud." The bow is like a bow and arrow. We call it a rainbow. Apparently, now this is not absolute, but it's apparently true that there were no rainbows prior to the flood. Otherwise, why would it be a unique, interesting thing? Apparently, the clouds prior to the flood prevented rainbows from happening. But now the clouds have cleared, and as the clouds clear, the sun shows through the clouds, and there in the clouds you'll see the rainbow in the sky. And every time we see a rainbow in the sky, we should be reminded that God has made a covenant with Noah, and there will never again be a universal flood. That things will move along in a very stable way until the end of time. That's what we can count on. Okay. In verse 18, let's do a couple of, let's get through a curse or two. This is a Canaanite city, and so we'll look at the curse on Canaan, which is a kind of an interesting thing. The three sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Noah began to be a man of the soil. He planted a vineyard, and as those of you who do any gardening know, it takes a while for bushes and trees to start producing fruit. So the next verse happens a couple of years later when the vines produced fruit, and Noah made the grapes into juice. The juice fermented. It seems to me that Noah simply didn't know that that was going to happen. It seems like he was taken by surprise. So he drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Very likely, prior to the flood, the fermentation process, which is a decay process, simply didn't happen, or it happened so slowly that grape juice stayed sweet for a long time, and Noah simply couldn't predict this. He didn't know that this was going to happen. So his grape juice turned into wine, and that happens after a period of time. And he drank some of the wine, and drank enough of it that he became drunk. And he lay uncovered in his tent. Now that's not a good thing. That means he was so drunk that he had passed out. He had his clothing in disarray, and his son Ham came in and saw his father. They went out and told his brothers, and then Shem and Japheth took a garment and they laid it on their shoulders and walked backwards and covered their father. And their faces were turned backwards, and they didn't see their dad, but they covered him up with respect. When Noah woke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." And he also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth. Let him dwell in the tents of Shem. And let Canaan be his servant." So this is actually going to be fulfilled in the Israelite conquest of the land of Canaan some thousands of years later. It's going to be a while before that actually happens. And this is the prediction that will happen. It's interesting to me that the curse is not on Ham, or not on, it's not on Ham, but on his son, Canaan. And I've never entirely understood that. But the curse is not on Ham, the curse is on Canaan, and that curse is fulfilled in the conquest of Canaan. Okay, the blessing on Shem is a blessing that emphasizes Shem's walk with God, the desire to know God. How to say this? Both Judaism and Christianity come out of the Middle East. For that matter, so does Islam, which is the major counterfeit monotheistic religion. All comes out of the Middle East. The rest of the world's religions tend to be either pantheistic, a belief that the universe is God, or some kind of animism. But monotheism is the Middle Eastern religion, the religion of the Shemites. And then may God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Okay, so the enlarging of Japheth is the prediction that Japheth will fill the earth. As we are going to see in the next chapter, chapter 10, takes us into a thing called the Table of Nations. This is a clay tablet with cuneiform in the background. All those little wedge-shaped marks have meanings that I can't read. I thought I would try to learn Akkadian cuneiform at one time, and I eventually thought better of it. A Table of Nations is the genealogy of the threefold division of mankind from Noah. These are the generations of the sons of Noah: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the sons of Japheth are going to be listed here. And if we take the time to follow these, we're not going to, I'm not going to read this whole thing. If we take time to follow those names, you discover that the Japheth tribes went north and east and west from the Middle East, from the area where the ark came to rest in the mountains of Urartu or Armenia. The tribes of Japheth went to the north and east and west. And so they went into Asia, they went into Central Asia, they went into Eastern Europe, they went into Western Europe. What we call the Eurasian landmass was covered up by Japheth. The Hamitic tribes, the sons of Ham, went south primarily into Africa. So Egypt and Libya and Ethiopia are all the Hamitic people groups. The sons of Shem stayed in the Middle East. They stayed in the area between the Mediterranean and Persia, roughly, the Middle Eastern area. And the three great language groups of the earth are today called the Hamitic language group, the Semitic language group for Shem, and the Indo-European language group, which is the languages of Japheth. So the European languages and the languages of Asia actually have common roots. They all relate to the languages of the Indus Valley in India. So that our very earliest language in India was called Sanskrit. Anyway, we'll get to some of that. Let's see. Okay, one of the important characters amongst the Hamites. I just need to. This is just kind of fun. This is something I don't usually include in my lecture, but I'll give you just a little special introduction here. In chapter 10 and verse 8, we see that Ham had 4 sons: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush were Sheba, Havilah, Sabta. The sons of Cush, one was Nimrod, and this is in verse 8. So Cush fathered Nimrod, and he was the first on earth to be a mighty man. The term mighty man there means a man of great substance, an elite ruler of some sort. And he was the first to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The Hebrew there is a little strange because it doesn't. The word hunter is not found in Hebrew. The word actually means slaughterer, someone who kills with great violence. This is not a nice thing to say about somebody. Here in North Idaho in America, if we think about a mighty hunter before the Lord, we think of somebody walking off into the woods in his flannel shirt with a deer rifle over his shoulder with a great big scope on it, and that's not Nimrod at all. Nimrod was a tyrant. He was a violent, outrageously corrupt very bad man. So he's a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Later on, we're going to see the Tower of Babel, which actually comes before this. Chapters 10 and 11 are reversed. Don't worry about it for now. But Nimrod planted cities, Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar, which is the southern Mesopotamian valley. And from there, he went into Assyria, which is the northern Mesopotamian valley, and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city, and so on. Okay, so what did Nimrod do? He started the world's first empire, and it included the entire Mesopotamian valley. The key city of the whole thing was Babel. We're not sure exactly where Babel was, but we know that it was in the Mesopotamian valley. It's very likely close to the present site of ancient Babylon. We know where Babylon was. Babylon is a city that we're going to run into for the entire rest of biblical history. Of all the cities in the whole world, there are two that are mentioned frequently in the Bible. One of those, of course, is Jerusalem. We're going to run into Jerusalem for the first time in just a few chapters when we get to the story of Abraham. Here in Genesis 10, we're introduced to Babylon, the other frequently mentioned city of the Bible. Jerusalem is mentioned over 2,000 times. Babylon is mentioned about 400 times. The closest competitor is Jericho with some 35 mentions. So Babylon and Jerusalem are going to be counterparts at opposite ends of a balance throughout all of history, and we should look for that. Here at the very beginning, we see the first worldwide empire building tyrant, a mighty slaughterer who starts a city that will end in Revelation 18 with fallen is Babylon the Great. So there is something of a continuity there. At the same time, we're going to run into Jerusalem. We'll start off with Melchizedek and the godly line of general revelation. We'll see Jerusalem throughout all of biblical history as the central city of the people of God. For all its ups and downs, it remains the focus all the way into the end of time. And at the end of time, heaven itself contains a new Jerusalem. Babylon will be fallen and destroyed forever, but Jerusalem will be renewed, rebuilt, and restored in heaven forever. So an interesting contrast, and we see the first hints of that here in chapter 10. Well, the rest of it is a whole bunch of genealogy. There's an awful lot of interesting detail that I'm not going to bother you with. When we get to chapter 11, we're introduced to the Tower of Babel. Now, I believe that the Tower of Babel was probably built during the time of Nimrod. I suspect that. I can't prove that, but it seems to be about right. Chapter 11 comes before chapter 10 chronologically. It's not a textual problem. It's just the way Moses decided to set it up. So chapter 11 starts out. The whole earth had one language and the same words. All right, think about that for just a moment, because Noah, obviously, spoke whatever he spoke, and he and his wife could talk with one another, and that was their native language, and that was the language that they'd learned from their parents and their parents before them, and it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve probably spoke the same language. There was one language that everyone who got onto the ark spoke. Shem, Ham, and Japheth all spoke the same language their parents spoke. Now, that's so obvious that it would come as a surprise to us if there were any other way to talk about it. Of course they did. Language is the most basic characteristic of mankind. You can tell one group of people from another group of people primarily by language. Skin color and eye shape and the rest really don't make any difference. If you've got different languages, you're a different people group. And one of the first things that we always have to do when we move from one place to another is to learn the local language. Otherwise, we have trouble communicating. We can't get along nearly as well. Language is a very, very important thing to all of us. That fact makes the presence of the multitude of differing languages on the earth troubling, because we have to explain that. We want to ask the question, and we want an answer to the question, why are there so many languages? Now, language consists of a couple of things. I'm going to stop this for a second and draw you another picture here. See if I can make this happen. Okay. Paul says language. Well, not Paul. Well, Paul will have a lot to talk about language. Language is composed of two things. And Paul says, now everyone had the same language and the same words. Language is what we call syntax, or the logic of language. There are all the stuff that has to do with grammar, nouns and verbs and verb forms and tenses and all that stuff that we hate studying when we have to learn languages. And words is the catalog of different sounds that we can make, what we call vocabulary. The same language means we have the same syntax and we have the same words. And you can tell one language from another by studying the syntax and the vocabulary. You can tell that you're dealing with a language and not noise, because there is a certain logic to the syntax, and there is a distinguishable set of vocabulary. The simplest languages on the planet have a complex logic and thousands of words in the vocabulary. And that's the simplest languages. Complex languages like Chinese or Arabic or English have got tens or even hundreds of thousands of words related by a complex logic. This is one of the reasons that I am not a Pentecostal. I believe that that human language is actually a very complex, intelligent function. Language is not Babel, and I use the term distinctly. The Tower of Babel is a bad thing that speaks of a satanic victory. And I prefer to communicate clearly with the logic of language syntax and the correct choice of vocabulary. When God speaks with us, he doesn't speak in babbling. He speaks with syntax and words. He uses real language. The gift of tongues was not the gift of babbling. The gift of tongues was the gift of genuine language. I've prayed for the gift of tongues on several occasions. Once when I was taking a final exam in Arabic, God said no, and I almost flunked the silly thing. And I've wished since then that I had a better facility with languages, and I don't. I have to study really, really hard to learn language, and the older I get, the harder it has become for me. Language is just tough. But the entire world, we're told, had one language and one set of vocabulary. And they could all communicate with one another. And as the people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, let's make bricks and burn them. And they had brick for stone, bitumen for mortar. And they said, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Now, the fundamental thing to understand here is they weren't talking to God. They weren't asking God about this. They were, as a group, they migrated to the east and they discover the plain of Shinar or Sumer, which we know from chapter 10 was Nimrod's territory. Babel was the first of his cities. And they said, let's make bricks instead of stone, and bitumen or tar instead of mortar. And let's build a tower, a big city and a tower in the middle of it. And then we won't have to disperse over the face of the earth. Now, God's commandment had been multiply, fill the earth, disperse. Each of you go your own way. But instead they insist on disobediently staying together. And so the Lord came down to see what they were up to. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people. They all have one language. This is only the beginning of what they'll do. Nothing that they purpose to do will now be impossible. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the earth. So this is the answer to the question, why are there so many languages? God initially confused the languages into three parts: a Japhethite language, a Shemitic language, and a Hamitic language. And as the people dispersed from one another, which is what happens, by the way, you get together in a group where people speak different languages, and eventually the stress gets to everybody, and there is a breaking into groups of the same language. It always happens, even among Christians, even when we don't want to. And the Italian speakers are over here, the Tagalog speakers are over there, and the English speakers are over there, and it always works that way, even when we want to stick together. So they spread apart, and as they spread geographically, we can find on the whole planet today, there are Indo-European languages, there are Semitic languages, and there are Hamitic languages. And they differ in terms of language and vocabulary, different kinds of logic. So I speak Hebrew. I don't speak it, I read Hebrew. That has an entirely different linguistic flavor than Italian, for example. Verb tenses work differently in Hebrew than they do in Italian. They're just different languages. Tagalog works differently than everything else. I'm not sure how Tagalog works, but it works. The Hamitic languages are different from both Semitic and Indo-European. So if If you spend a while in Italy, you pick up Italian, and you cross the border into France, and you pick up some French, and you cross another border, and you pick up some Spanish. You'll find that those are related and they're different, but they're all Indo-European languages. If you cross the Mediterranean into North Africa and start trying to pick up the indigenous languages. Well, Arabic is a Semitic language, and you'll find it in a lot of places. But if you try to pick up Tuareg, for instance, or Swahili, you'll find those are Hamitic languages, and their logic is different from all of the others. It's a different set of words and a different set of logic. And those languages change over time and over geography, and we can actually track that. In chapter 11, beginning at verse 10, we see the succession list from Shem. These are the generations of Shem. This is a genealogy that takes us from Shem, Noah's son, down to Abraham. There's some textual trouble in this passage as to exactly how long this was. My English Standard Version here would add up to about 250 years. I don't believe that's quite enough time. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, has about another 500 years in this section. So I believe the flood probably happened sometime prior to 3000 BC. Human civilizations seem to have begun about 3000 BC, give or take 100 years or so. And those civilizations began in India, in Mesopotamia, and in Egypt. And that fits the biblical pattern. At the end of this genealogy, we see Nahor, who fathered Terah, and Terah, who fathered Abram and Nahor and Haran. And it was the generations of Terah who are going to be singled out for, frankly, the rest of Old Testament history. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abraham and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. Okay, this is interesting stuff. And the details are what end up being important. We see Abram here is a man who was raised in Ur of the Chaldees. Chaldees is Babylon, southern Mesopotamia, either Sumer or Akkad in the ancient world. Ur could be any of a couple of places, but I think the southern part of the Mesopotamian valley. The Ur that is most likely to be the right place was a major city in the ancient world of some hundreds of thousands of people. It had great big temples to a variety of pagan gods. Abraham, like his father Terah, was probably a worshiper of the moon god. Abraham was not chosen by God in chapter 12 because he was a good man. Abraham was saved because God is good, not because Abraham was good. That is so important for us to understand. Abraham was saved out of his pagan background. God reached down to lift him up. God didn't have to climb up to look around and find the good guys. God knew there weren't any. He reached down to save one, and that would be Abraham. Terah was an idolater of the worst sort. Abraham grew up in Ur, which was a city of the worst sort of idolatry. While Abram was a young man, the family moved to Haran in the northern part of the Mesopotamian Valley, which was a center for the worship of the moon. We're going to see more moon worship later on. Terah's name means devotee of the moon. Moon worship was one of the worst of the pagan religions of the ancient world. It was really, really bad. And I'm not going to give you a bunch of details about that. But Terah was not a good man, and either was Abraham. So Abram, along with nephew Lot, are going to be at the core of this story for a while. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, was barren. She had no child. Okay, so Abraham is going to be the main character, and you'll note I go back and forth between the names. Abram is the original name. Abraham is the name that he will take later on. I'll show you that, chapter 17. But the point of the Abraham story is the son that he will have by Sarah. But Sarah is barren. She had no child. That's the key to the whole story. That sets the theme for the whole story. Because what God will do over these next few chapters is to produce the next child in the line of promise. When we read through this whole genealogy from Adam, we've seen a genealogy that goes through Seth, through a string of patriarchs down to Noah, then through Shem, and from Shem on through this list of descendants of Shem, through Arphaxad and Shelah and Eber and Peleg and all of these guys, down through Terah, then through Abraham. And now the line is going to continue. This is the messianic line. This is the line of Christ. So when we understand this, we look at this story unfolding and we recognize Abraham and Sarah are at the core of the biblical story. They are the great, 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 great grandparents of Jesus. So this can't be anything but very important. This is central to biblical history. So Terah took Abraham his son. They went to a son of Haran, his grandson, Sarai, daughter-in-law, and Abraham's wife. They went forth from Ur of the Chaldeans into the land of Canaan. When they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died at Haran. And it's after that time that Abraham, Sarah, and Lot and their families, their possessions, went on to Canaan. Abraham is elsewhere called a wandering Aramean. Aramean is the same as Amorite. Don't ask me why. It just is just true. An Amorite or an Aramean is in the Akkadian language a Westerner, or somebody who went west. They're migrants who left Mesopotamia to go to the greener pastures far in the west in a place called Canaan. And this happens around the year 2000 BC, give or take quite a bit. But right around 2000 BC, we know that there was a period of time when some catastrophe led to the departure from Mesopotamia of very large numbers of these Arameans. Abraham was a part of that. and the migration as far as Haran stopped there because Terah wanted to worship the moon. Abraham stayed there as long as his father lived, then went on to Canaan. So they went forth out of Ur into the land of Canaan. They came to Haran. Terah died at Haran. Now the Lord said to Abram, there, 12:1 is this major shift. And I think I've sent notes for chapter 12. We're not going to get far into chapter 12. I just want to introduce this, and then on Wednesday we will come back and look at this with a little more detail. There's quite a bit here. Now the Lord said to Abram, we ought to ask a question right at the beginning. How did Abram know that it was God speaking? And the fact is, the Bible doesn't tell us. There wasn't a fanfare. There weren't trumpets in the clouds. The angels didn't come by on camels. We don't know exactly how Abram knew, but he did. And I would argue that if God were to appear to you today, if God himself were to make himself manifest to you, you would be right to recognize that that was God. Abraham simply recognized the voice of God when he heard it. And God said this, go from your country, from your kindred, from your father's house, to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Verse 4 is an essential part of this. I'll just read the first part. So Abram went. God said, go. So Abram went. Let's think about that for just a second, because right there we're going to find the essence of the biblical concept of faith. We talk about Abraham being the man of faith. Well, so he was. When we think about Abram's faith, what was this really? God said, go. So Abram went. Okay, when God says go, faith involves going. Abram went. Now, when we analyze what's going on there, something happened. There's a word that Abram recognizes, and he develops a willingness to trust that word that results in obedience. There's three components here. I'm going to clear the drawing, and we're going to look at a definition. This is a definition that I may have given you for the book of Romans. Faith is an attitude of trust built on knowledge of God's word, and I'll underline knowledge, that results in active obedience. Okay, there is a trust component, which is an attitude. You can either trust or not trust a thing. I don't trust my computer very well, but sometimes it doesn't betray me. So sometimes I have to trust it to get me through a session, but I never know when it's going to decide to give up. Some things I trust more than other things. I trust my car fairly well because I take pretty good care of it. So I know that it's going to take care of me. I trust my wife. I know she's going to make a good dinner for me and not poison me, stuff like that. How do I know that? Well, we just celebrated 49 years together, and she hasn't poisoned me yet. So I think I can. By this time, she's demonstrated some trustworthiness. How do we trust anything? Well, we look at the evidence, we look at the situation, we decide whether or not we're going to trust. So the development of an attitude of trust in God has to be built on something. And the idea of biblical faith is always built here on a knowledge of God's word. What has God said? Well, God said, go. That's what God said. Abram understood that this was God speaking to him, that he was receiving the command to go. And there's a continuing content to the go to the land I'm going to show you, and I'm going to bless you and make your name great, and I'll make you the father of a great nation. Through you all of the nations of the earth will be blessed. All of that is in this. But the go is the major thing. And Abram knew that God had said this, and he has an attitude of trust. Now, I have to tell you that I believe that this attitude of trust is in itself a gift of God. I think God made it possible for Abraham to believe. God reached down and threw a switch and brought Abraham from death, the death of his sinful life in Ur, and switched him from that death into life. That's where regeneration happened. And Abraham began to trust God, which is the first symptom of being born again. And that trust is built on a knowledge of God's word. The result is Abram went. Okay? God said go, so Abram went. That's active obedience to God. Faith isn't a feeling. Faith isn't a warm, fuzzy emotion that makes you feel good about being around God. Faith is active obedience. When I am faithful to God, that means that I am doing what God has commanded me to do. Abraham is the primary object lesson throughout all of the rest of the Bible of this concept of faith. We're going to come back to this definition several times. Faith is always going to be the attitude of trust built on a knowledge of God's word that results in active obedience to God. And that faith is at the core of Abrahamic religion. This is so important. Abraham's faith is at the core of Old Testament religion. It's wrong for us to say that there is no faith in the Old Testament. It's all over the place. It's happening all the time. Everyone who was ever saved was justified by faith. Everyone. That includes Abraham. That includes Noah. That includes every biblical character that we know. who is born again. You and I are saved in exactly the same way. Abraham was not saved because he went. Abraham went because he was saved. And on that core, we're going to build the rest of biblical theology. So I'm going to knock this off. We're going to unmute everybody. Oh boy, here it comes. Unmute the whole crowd, and Donna's going to get up from across the room, and she's wearing pink, so it won't be too bad against this green background. There we go. Now I can hear everybody. Bye-bye, everybody. Hey, Oscar, bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, our pleasure. We're glad we could spend this time. Yeah. You guys have a good sleep, and we'll see you again on Wednesday. Blessings to everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.
All right. End the meeting. Leave the meeting.
Oh,